The Beekeeper's French, A Personal History of Jews in Iran. By Elias Winter. September the 24th, 2025. Read by an automated voice. Section 1. The Door That Spoke French. They built it, first, as a promise against humiliation. In Paris, 1860, a circle of French Jews, humbled by the memory of the Damascus Affair, sharpened by the new grammar of emancipation, founded the Alliance Israélite Universelle. Their wager was simple and radical. If you give children schools, you give them standing. If you give them French, you give them a passport into the modern world that no border guard can fully take away. The alliance would be philanthropy as infrastructure, a chain of classrooms stretching from North Africa to the Levant to Persia, where chalk and hygiene and arithmetic could do what pity never could. From Paris the letters went out, and in the late 19th century the shutters opened in Tehran, then Hamadan, Isfahan, Shiraz, Kermanshah. The method was humane and stubborn. Train local teachers, pay them reliably, import primers and soap, drill the hand to hold a pen, the mouth to shape vowels that carried far. The schools were Jewish by charter and hope, but their doors were wider than creed. Muslims and Christians sometimes taught there. Some enrolled their children. Modernity entered like a practical light. Timetables, readers, ledgers, refusing to ask ancestry before it illuminated a desk. That is the hinge where my family's story clicks into the world's. 3 of my 4 grandparents, not Jewish, taught inside that French project made by Jews. They came home with chalk on their cuffs and news of a pedagogy that made a child sit straighter without fear. My father and his sister were registered at the Alliance School. In our house, French arrived not as a country, but as daylight. Copybooks, sums, a certain crispness in how sentences chose their clothes. The alliance had not been designed for us, and yet it opened for us, the way a bridge meant for one caravan still bears the weight of another. I did not know then that institutions are rivers. I did not know that someone else's rescue mission could carry a different family downstream without stealing anyone's boat. But that is how it happened. The alliance, born from the ache of Jewish vulnerability and the audacity of Jewish emancipation, taught my father to write with a measured hand and to hear himself in a wider register. At 17, he followed that register to France, a door within the door, where the curriculum became a city and the accent became a life. History prefers clean categories. The classroom refuses them. In those Iranian quarters, the alliance made a trilingual ethics, Hebrew prayers beside Persian errands beside French examinations. Dignity was rehearsed in the minor key. Punctuality, soap, eyesight tests, a girl learning to read aloud while an aunt wept quietly in the hallway. The project's genius was unromantic. A timetable could be an emancipation document. A teacher's salary, paid on time, could be a political philosophy. And from that philosophy came our household grammar. My grandparents carrying home lesson plans. My father declining a verb tense with the calm of someone who belongs. If I am French today, it is because a Jewish institution in Iran decided that the remedy for powerlessness was competence, and competence needs schools. My passport is signed by a ministry, yes, but it was first stamped by a blackboard in a city where the Alliance set down its portable republic of letters. Before the mountains, before the bees, before the border crossings and their polite interrogations, there was this, a door of French in a Persian street, raised by Jewish hands for Jewish children, wide enough for us as well. Every door has an ancestor. This one's ancestor stands far back, in the Persian light of Cyrus, when a different kind of permission turned captivity into caravan. The alliance was a modern echo of that older hinge. Empire once opened a gate. In our century, a school did. And because it did, a boy from an Iranian classroom learned to speak himself across water. Because it did, a child, me, would be carried later on the sound of his sentences. So let the essay begin where the light first touched our table, with a Jewish school that made neighbors out of strangers, French out of silence, and a future out of chalk. From that room, we can walk backward to Babylon and forward to Tehran. From that room, we can watch Judaism in Iran become not a footnote, but a line of continuity. And we can take our place on it without apology.
Section 2. The Gates Open. Cyrus, Babylon, and the First Return. Night lay heavy on Babylon, the week the river fell. Soldiers in leather and bronze had worked upstream like patient thieves, cutting the Euphrates into channels until its current slackened and the waterline sank below the threshold of the river gates. Inside the city, the priests of Marduk had long since soured on their king. Nabonidus had quarrelled with the temple order and decamped for the desert. Ritual had become politics, and politics had become a sulk. The city's pride was intact, but its loyalties were not. When the Persians came, they did not roar, they entered. The chronicles are spare. A battle at Opis, the taking of Sippar, and then Babylon opened from within. The bronze fittings on the river gates brushed the lowering water, and soldiers slipped under the lintel where boats had once passed. In the official language of empire, there is no drama, only verbs. Entered, took, appointed. But even bureaucratic lines can hum with destiny. The city that had once swallowed nations now changed custody with hardly a flame. At the center of this quiet conquest stood Cyrus, not yet the Great in marble and legend, only a king who understood frontiers. He had learned the old Near Eastern secret. You keep a realm by stabilizing cults, not by insulting them. Cyrus did not invent kindness. He perfected policy. He knew you hold a vast realm by letting peoples be themselves in public. Return the icons, reopen the shrines, repatriate the exiles, and they will pray for your sons while they pay your taxes. The clay Cyrus cylinder, his announcement to Mesopotamia, says exactly that for the gods of Babylon. It does not name Judah. Small provinces seldom make it into marble, but the principle travelled farther than the scribe's list. In a language the Judeans could understand, the news became permission. The Book of Ezra remembers it this way. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth and charged me to build him a house in Jerusalem. The sentence is imperial and devotional at once. Politically, it's a stabilization order. Theologically, it is providence wearing a foreign crown. The prophet Isaiah goes further, daring to call Cyrus my anointed, Mashiach, a word reserved for Israel's kings. The shock is the point. God can keep a promise by borrowing a stranger's hand. Caravans formed. Not all at once, and not all of them. Exile rearranges routes, but enough to make the roads look like patience. There were lists, names upon names, families counting themselves into the future. The Persians sent back the temple vessels the Babylonians had catalogued and kept. Sheshbazzar, a prince of David's line with a Persian title on his belt, carried them home like proof that memory could be weighed. Jerusalem was a skeleton when they arrived. There is a detail that feels like a heartbeat, the altar before the walls. They raised it on the old platform, and smoke began again without the city's body yet mended. Worship then safety. This order tells you what mattered. Foundations were staked. The ground received the outline of a second house. Then came the first resistance, the way resistance usually comes, a polite offer that is also a threat. "Let us build with you," neighbors said, "for we seek your God, too." The answer was flint. "No. This house is ours to raise." And just like that, letters started galloping east with accusations. These people are rebels by heritage. Finish the walls, and they will stop paying. While at home, the work slowed. Suspense entered the story as paper. Kings changed. Darius took the throne after a season of daggers. In Jerusalem, two voices rose, Haggai and Zechariah, with a mixture of scolding and promise. "Panelled houses for yourselves, but the house of God bare? Build." "The future is larger than the foundation trench you see," the governor of the province wrote to the court. Who authorized this? Somewhere in media, in the cold archive rooms of Ecbatana, clerks untied a string and unrolled a scroll no one had touched in years. There it was, the earlier edict of Cyrus authorizing the temple's reconstruction, dimensions noted, expenses charged to the royal treasury. Darius replied with the steel of a practical ruler. "Let them build, supply timber and grain and oil, so that they may offer pleasing sacrifices for the life of the king and his sons." The penalty for interference was vivid and architectural. Pull a beam from the offender's house and hang him on it. Empires can be tolerant. They are never shy. The work surged. Stones found their old conversations. Cedar learned its weight again. Gold remembered where to shine. In the 6th year of Darius, the second temple stood. They dedicated it with animals counted out like gratitude, and kept Passover as if time itself had been spliced back together. The elders who remembered the first house wept, not because the second was poor, but because memory is heavier than stone. Joy arrived braided with ache. That is what restoration feels like when you are honest. So what, precisely, did Cyrus do for the Jews? And what did God do through Cyrus? He ended the Babylonian policy of scattering and gave legal permission to restore a temple and a people. He financed the project as part of an imperial strategy. He started a pattern Persia would keep: toleration with receipts. From the prophetic side of the ledger, God kept a promise to a remnant by calling an outsider anointed, proving that covenant can recruit any instrument it needs. From the administrative side, a smart king pacified a frontier. Those ledgers do not cancel each other. They explain why the door opened and why the people called it deliverance. That is the beginning of Judaism in Iran. Not a footnote, not an accident, but a corridor opened by a Persian policy and filled by a Jewish hope. The gate in Babylon swung on hinges of strategy and faith at once. Through it walked caravans toward Jerusalem, and through it also ran a line that would anchor Jewish life for centuries in Susa and Hamadan, under a sky that, for a crucial season, belonged to a king willing to let God keep his word.
Section 3. Yehud, under the Achaemenids, Jerusalem, Susa, and the making of a people. Empires do not only conquer, they administer. After the edicts and the caravans, life in Yehud settled into the grammar of Persian rule: receipts, inspections, roads that held their stones, and governors whose titles tasted foreign on the tongue. The province was small, a postage stamp inside the larger satrapy of Aber Nari, the beyond-the-river lands that curled along the Levantine coast. Its governor, the Peha, answered to higher officials who answered to the king, and the king wintered far away in Susa. The language of the empire was Imperial Aramaic, the common script of letters and ledgers. Priests in Jerusalem learned to read not only Torah scrolls, but also correspondence stamped with Persian seals. Taxes moved eastward in grain and silver. Permissions moved westward in countersigned decrees. The temple rose again, but its pillars stood inside an imperial system that kept time with trumpets of its own. Jerusalem's heart began to beat in new ways. With kingship gone and the covenant rethreading itself around the sanctuary, Judaism, not merely Israelite monarchy, took shape. The altar's smoke was not nostalgia. It was a recalibration. The people who had been a kingdom learned to be a community under law. You can watch it happen in scenes. First, the altar before the walls. Sacrifice resumed under open sky, a declaration that worship is not a luxury postponed until safety. It is the practice that makes safety thinkable. Then the walls at last, stone shouldering stone around a city that had learned humility the hard way. When Nehemiah came from Susa, a cupbearer turned governor, he walked the ruined perimeter by night, a lamp moving along fractures. He organized shifts, trowel in one hand, spear in the other. Letters flew again, accusations, appeals, and the walls climbed despite mockery pitched across the valley. A trumpet was kept ready. Wherever it sounded, workers rallied. You do not forget how to build once you have lost everything. Then the Great Assembly. The Torah unrolled on a platform. Ezra reading at daybreak. Levites translating and explaining so the words could land in every ear. People stood for hours under sun and shade, wept, and were told not to. This day is holy. Eat and drink, and send portions to those who have nothing prepared. Law arrived not as a lash, but as a feast, and with it a painful requirement. Marriages undone, households split, a patrol at the gates to keep Sabbath trade from turning life back into a marketplace. Boundary making is never only doctrine, it is logistics. A people is not a ghost, it is a timetable and a refusal. Yehud printed its face on silver, Yehud coinage, a small sovereignty struck within the empire's permission. Priests knew the rhythms of sacrificial days, scribes knew where to find the satrap's man. It was a dual fluency, God's calendar and the king's courier. And while Jerusalem relearned its center, the story kept circling back to Iranian cities, where the court breathed and decisions condensed. Susa, Shushan, was the empire's winter lung, its colonnades echoing with footsteps and rumor. From those rooms, Nehemiah received leave to rebuild. From those rooms, another, more perilous story unfolded, the one tradition sets in the reign of a king called Ahasuerus. The palace corridors in that tale have the feel of polished stone and careful silence. A young woman, Esther, is brought into the orbit of power with her guardian's warning in her ear. Do not name your people yet. A plot ferments at the level of paper and vanity. Haman, infuriated by Mordecai's refusal to bow, persuades the king to sign a kill-by edict against a people who have learned, once again, to keep their difference. The suspense is the old kind, sharpened. Death by bureaucracy, delivered to every province. What breaks the edict is not an army, but a reversal staged in law. Esther discloses Haman's gallows claim their author, and a second decree gives the Jews permission to defend themselves on the day the first decree ripens. The story ends not with annihilation, but with a new festival, Purim, born of letters sent out from Susa to every satrapy, a holiday that knows the weight of sealed orders and the sweetness of reprieve. Whether you read Esther as court tale, carnival mirror, or survivor's memory, the point is unmistakable. The Jewish map now includes Iranian palaces as sites of Jewish time. Other addresses dotted the Persian sphere. Ecbatana, today's Hamadan, would one day be marked by the shrine of Esther and Mordecai, a memory kept in stone and story. Shush, Susa, would be linked with Daniel, the dream reader who served kings who spoke different languages but shared the same impatience with mystery. These shrines are not footnotes. They are proof that Iran was not simply the empire overhead, but also ground under Jewish feet, a place where synagogues would light lamps, and where Jewish time could be counted in streets and seasons. Beyond the Iranian plateau, Persian power held other Jewish experiments together. In distant Elephantine on the Nile's cataracts, a Jewish garrison kept a temple of its own and wrote papyrus letters in the empire's Aramaic, petitioning Persian officials, copying Jerusalem, negotiating with neighbors. Their very existence complicated Jerusalem's insistence on a single cult site. Under the wide tent of a Achaemenid administration, plural Jewish lives were possible: a rebuilt temple in Zion, a functioning one in Egypt, and court Jews in Susa, composing a feast out of fear. Empire did not make uniformity, it made room, so the Achaemenid centuries did more than rescue a remnant from exile. They forged a pattern that would endure in Iranian Jewish time: worship within the weather of a larger power, identity secured not only by kings, but by law, ritual, and learning. A home in Jerusalem that never cancelled the reality of homes elsewhere. In the ledgers of the court, Yehud was a quiet province that paid what it owed. In the scriptures and memories of a people, it was the place where covenant learned to live without a throne, and where Iran, through Susa and Hamadan, became a permanent coordinate on the Jewish compass. If Cyrus was the hinge, the Achaemenid routine was the doorway's daily use. The creak of a gate that opens every morning, the dust swept from thresholds, the guard who nods as workers pass carrying cedar and bread. Inside that ordinary passage, a people learned to be themselves again, not by disappearing into empire, and not by defying it at every turn, but by practicing their difference with enough steadiness that even kings learned to make room for it.
Section 4. 2 Jewries, 1 Persian world, Parthian to Sasanian. After the edicts turned to routine and the temple smoke learned the hours, the map did something unexpected. It grew 2 hearts. One beat in the hills of Judah under foreign flags, the other throbbed farther east, in the lowlands of the Tigris and Euphrates, under the long shadow of Iran. Between them ran roads of question and answer, letters bundled like figs on a string, halakhic puzzles wrapped in wax, news of births and burials and kings. When Rome tightened its fist on Judea, first in the year 70, then again after the last rebellion in 135, the Western heart faltered. The Mishnah would be gathered on Roman soil, yes, a codex of stubborn order, but the center of gravity drifted east. Parthia, Iranian in its bones, looser in its grip, offered the kind of space where communities could breathe if they remembered their place. There, Jewish life rearranged its furniture without surrendering the house. Picture a road at dusk along the Diyala, pack donkeys, dates in baskets, a messenger whose satchel holds 2 kinds of papers, trade accounts for a silk broker in Ctesiphon, and a query for a rabbi in Sura about the minimum height of a sukkah. Markets and halakha shared couriers. Under the Parthians, the Jewish exilarch, the Resh Galuta, heir, they said, to David, sat like a hinge between people and power, collecting taxes, adjudicating quarrels, offering the Shah's court a Jewish face that could be praised or punished in public without cracking the whole community. Then the dynasty changed. The Sasanians rose, 224 CE, hardening the Persian backbone and enthroning 12 forebears of a different sort, Zoroastrian magi, fire temples bright against the night. The new state believed in order that glowed. The priesthood carried a book and a flame. Suspicion travelled with them, especially toward those with allegiances across borders. Christians, the cousins whose empire was Rome, suffered most under eyes that saw treason in baptismal fonts. Jews, with no emperor of their own, sometimes fared better, sometimes not. The line rose and fell like desert wind, years of quiet commerce and study, flare-ups of accusation, a governor's zeal, a priest's complaint, a king who needed a scapegoat. And yet, in that weather, a wonder. The Babylonian Talmud took shape. Do not imagine a single author at a clean table. Imagine centuries of evenings. Oil lamps guttering in Surah and Pumbedita. Students arguing with their teachers and with the dead. Margins growing antlers of commentary until the page looked like a city seen from above. A case about an ox's goring opens into a philosophy of intention. A story about a neighbour's oven becomes an argument about authority that shakes the rafters and then laughs. Outside, tax collectors count grain. Inside, law becomes music you can live by even when kings change their hats. From time to time, the outer world strides in. Word comes of a new decree, a noble's whim, a local riot. The exilarch is summoned, scolded, honoured, fined. A shapur favours the academies. A kavad or hormizd grows prickly. Courtiers whisper. Ministers change. A governor's nephew has a debt and decides to collect it with theology. The sages keep writing. Occasionally a passage cracks with heat, a reminder that study in exile is not a luxury, but a survival art. Then the temperature settles, the lamps are trimmed, and the next discussion begins. If one loses an object with identifying marks. Meanwhile, on the Iranian plateau, Jewish life keeps local time. Hamadan, Ekbatana, makes room for a memory of Esther and Mordecai turned into stone and story. Isfahan builds a quarter whose streets learn Hebrew melodies. Ray and Shiraz count their own cycles of festival and loss. Traders move out along the arteries that will one day be called the Silk Road, following caravans eastward toward Merv and Nishapur, westward to Antioch and beyond. Some families become multilingual out of necessity. Children answer a Zoroastrian neighbor in Persian by day and a rabbi in Aramaic at dusk. A Friday market becomes a school in the afternoon. A courtyard becomes a court at night. Back west, Roman Palestine tends a different lamp. The Jerusalem Talmud, shorter, breathless, nervous with Roman pressure, comes to a close in the 4th to 5th centuries, a book like a held breath. The Eastern work keeps going, adding layers while empires trade blows along the frontier. Messengers carry disputes from Galilee to Babylonia and back again. Which calendar shall we keep when clouds hide the moon? A letter asks. Yours, the East replies, and with that answer, time itself begins to be kept by an Iranian sky. This is what I mean by two Jewries. Not enemies, not estranged, but different habits of survival under different suns. In the West, Judaism learns to live with an empire that thinks of itself as universal law. In the East, it learns to live under a crown that thinks of itself as cosmic order presided over by fire. The same Torah, two styles of weatherproofing. The same prayer, two kinds of caution. And between them, affection that travels by letter and guest. Questions crossing deserts like shy merchants, answers arriving with dust in their folds. Toward the end of Sasanian time, the great compilation nears its seal. Editors, anonymous as rain, gather the shahs like harvesters. They do not polish out the quarrels, they preserve them. A people that has known kings as weather learns to institutionalize argument as shelter. The last redactors look up from their pages and see a world tipping again. Another empire is forming on the horizon, with a new language and a new certainty. But that is for the next chapter. What matters here is the shape that took under Iranian skies. A Judaism sturdy enough to outlast architecture, nimble enough to keep law portable, proud enough to mint its own time, humble enough to share streets with those who tended sacred fire. In palaces, kings counted provinces. In academies, scholars counted reasons. Between them, the Jewish presence in the Persian world matured into the thing it would remain for centuries, not a guest who might leave at any moment, and not a master of the house, but a tenant of history who knows where the load-bearing walls are and how to mend a crack before winter. Two hearts, then. Jerusalem's lamp and Babylonia's blaze. The West gave the Jewish tradition a creed of memory. They were there first. The East gave them a cathedral of thought. They would still be there when the wind changed. Together, these hearts shaped a people able to recognize itself under different flags, including, for a long time, the banners that flew from Iranian spears. The road between those hearts is old. It is still being walked.
Section 5. After the Gate. Islam and the Long Middle, 7th to 15th centuries. The door Cyrus opened did not close when the Sasanian crown fell. It changed hands. In the mid-7th century, Arab armies crossed the mountains like a new weather front, and with them came a law that recognized them without embracing them. Under Islam, Jews became dhims, people of the book, named in the ledger, taxed by the jizya, and licensed to endure. It was second-class citizenship, but it was also policy, and policy can be kinder than moods. After Sasanian swings between favor and fury, this new arrangement could feel like a stable, narrow road. Not wide, not free, but walkable. The caliphs raised new capitals. The map redrew its center of gravity to Baghdad. There, the empire's river shone with boats and arguments, and the Jewish world found its headquarters of the mind. The Babylonian Talmud had already been sealed in late Sasanian dusk, but under the Abbasids, 8th to 10th century, the academies of Sura and Pumbedita breathed like twin furnaces. Geonim answered questions from as far as Spain and as near as Hamadan. Parchment left Iran with a doubt and returned with a ruling. Persian Jews were a visible thread in this fabric, sending queries, paying stipends, dispatching sons to study, and receiving back what mattered most in diaspora: time kept in common. If Rome had broken their walls, Baghdad taught them to live by calendars and clauses, portable architecture. Then the centuries began to tilt and sway. After the Abbasid high noon, the court's light fell across many dynastic faces: Buyids, Seljuks, Ghaznavids, and lords whose names survive in coins and chronicle margins. The pattern for Jews was a weave of permission and pressure. In one city, a physician with a steady hand treated a vizier and walked home unbothered. In another, a jurist's sermon turned into a market decree. Distinct dress, a badge, a fine that felt like a bruise. They learned the old art of reading weather, which governor had an accountant's soul, and which had a zealot's, when to be visible, when to borrow the invisibility of a shop curtain. The 13th century opened like a drum. Mongols rode in with wind and ash, and at first their rule brought a strange tolerance. An empire of many gods tends to prefer tribute over uniformity. Merchants moved, scholars copied, synagogues kept their lamps. Then the hinge turned again. The Ilkhan Ghazan embraced Islam, 1295, and the policy climate changed. New clerics, new rules, old suspicions with fresh ink. What had been latitude narrowed to a corridor. You could still walk, but single file. Across these 9 centuries, The Jewish presence in Iran did not vanish. It specialized. They became traders, dyers, goldsmiths, physicians, translators at the seams of languages. They tended Judeo-Persian letters, writing Persian in Hebrew script so that Esther could rhyme with Rostam on the same page. Their safety was never guaranteed, but neither was their erasure fated. The Islamic order, at its best, offered recognized smallness. At its worst, it threatened performed humiliation. Between those poles, a people learned the discipline of portable dignity. Sabbath counted even when the bazaar stayed open. Law studied even when courts frowned. A child taught to pray in a house whose windows knew when to whisper. By the time the Safavids would make Shi'ism the state's creed and sharpen the lines yet again, Iranian Jewry had already mastered the craft of continuance, living under Muslim sovereignty without surrendering Jewish time, answering to governors while corresponding with geonym, and surviving long middles where history offers no miracle, only endurance with receipts.
Section 6. Light and Shadow under the Safavids. When the Safavids took the throne in 1501 and dyed the empire's banner the colour of Twelver Shi'ism, the weather changed. The creed of the state was no longer a polite umbrella over many faiths. It became a fire in the centre of the room. Priests, mujtahids with long memories and longer sleeves, stepped closer to the levers of law. A new grammar of purity and proximity spread from pulpits into streets. Who could touch whom? Which liquids could be shared? What a shopkeeper should do if a neighbour of another faith reached for a cup. Theologians argued about impurity, najasat, in books. Apprentices heard it in the market. For Jews, and for other minorities, the Safavid centuries were life in chiaroscuro. The light, protection as dims, permission to keep synagogues, tend cemeteries, and run their quarters' internal courts. The shadow, restrictions that thickened with clerical zeal, special clothing in some towns, bans on riding horses, fines that felt like punishments pretending to be taxes, and, in certain seasons, a sermon that travelled from a mosque to a street like a spark, looking for kindling. Still, the cities breathed. Isfahan, the capital in its golden hour under Shah Abbas I, became a stage of arches and water. Across the river, the Shah settled New Julfa for the Armenians, proof that commerce could be cared for even as creeds stiffened. In the Jewish mahallas of Isfahan, Kashan, Yazd, Shiraz, and Hamadan, the week kept its rhythm. Market bargaining that turned into gossip, gossip that turned into matchmaking, a rabbi's ruling posted like a weather report on a courtyard door. Jewish physicians treated Muslim nobles. Goldsmiths kept their benches bright. Dyers stained their hands blue with indigo that would end up as a sash on a courtier's waist. Then the wind would pivot. A new governor eager to please the clergy. A jurist with a talent for thunder. A rumour that someone had touched something, or someone, they shouldn't have. The line between customary subordination and humiliation could be crossed in a single decree. In Isfahan itself, 17th century chronicles recall a wave of coercion, Jews pressed to convert, then slowly, partially, allowed to unpress, to return by law's back door to the lives they had left in fear. The memory lives in texts whose titles tell their truth without ornament. The Book of the Forced Convert. The chroniclers are poets, because you must be a poet to list a community's griefs without losing your mind. Yet even as the shadow lengthened in certain reigns, the light did not go out. Judeo-Persian literature continued its long conversation with scripture and the Shahnameh. Scribes copied epics in Persian, written with Hebrew letters, letting kings and prophets share a page. A boy learned to chant Torah with piyutim in a scale borrowed from his neighbor's lullaby. A girl learned to balance a basket on her head and a calendar in her hands. The Jewish community did not only survive the Safavids, they made things: poems, contracts, recipes, lullabies, a way of speaking that could slip between Aramaic in the Beit Midrash and Persian in the bazaar without changing its soul. Safavid piety had its contradictions. The same court that staged religious spectacle also loved craft, not just as wealth, but as prestige. A Jew who could set a gemstone or stop a fever might be escorted through a guarded gate no member of his quarter could normally pass. Impure in the market at noon, indispensable in the palace by dusk. That seesaw was the daily truth of being a minority in a theocratic empire that still needed you. Under Shah Abbas II, and then Suleiman and Sultan Hussein, the ulama tightened their grip. A towering cleric like Muhammad Baqir Majlis could turn a footnote of law into an atmosphere, his pages insisting on the separation of communities, the fencing of bodies, the careful choreography of touch and trade. Some of that became policy in streets: new rules, new dress, new fines. Some of it stayed as posture, a sermon's posture settling over a neighborhood like dust. Jews learned the art of reading weather, which judge to avoid, which alley to take, which Friday to shut their doors early and pray in whispers. Then came the cracks, the Afghan Hotak rebellion, the unspooling of authority. 1722, like a trap-door opening beneath the capital. In the confusion, everyone's status became conditional, which is another way of saying dangerous. The fall of the Safavids did not immediately free anyone. It unraveled the thread that had kept both safety and subordination woven together. Neighbor looked at neighbor and measured possibilities with his eyes. In some towns, the Jewish quarter was left to its own worry and did fine. In others, a gang, a sermon, a debt became a night with no law behind it. What did the Safavid centuries leave behind? A craftsman's memory of endurance and a scholar's memory of boundaries. Jews learned the choreography of survival in a state that moralized space: which doors to touch, which liquids to share, where to place one's body on a street when a procession passed. They learned to make beauty anyway. Thread counted, dough braided, letters copied. They learned to stake their dignity not in the good moods of ministers, but in the practice of difference. Sabbath kept even when the shop next door stayed open. Fasts counted even when the court feasted. Children taught a language that could outlive a dynasty. And they learned something else that would matter in the next act: how quickly a doctrine in a book can become a law in a lane. That knowledge would follow them into the 19th century, when a mob in Mashhad would force an entire community to perform Islam by day and preserve Judaism by night. And into the 20th, when statecraft would flip again, this time towards secular modernization, French schools, and Jewish ascent. But before we get there, hold this: light and shadow together. The Safavid chapter is not a parable of unbroken persecution or soft tolerance. It is a weave. The pattern is beautiful from a distance and rough against the skin up close. Jews wore it anyway, and they learned how to mend.
Section 7. Modernity in French. Alliance to Pahlavi. The 19th century unrolled across a school desk. A teacher snapped a string around a roll of paper, untied it, and there was France, not as a country, but as a curriculum. The Alliance Israélite Universelle, born in Paris to lift Jewish communities through education, arrived in Qajar, Iran with slates, primers, and a promise that vowels could be passports. In Tehran, Isfahan, Shiraz, Hamadan, Kermanshah, Boys and girls learned to hold pens like instruments. Arithmetic kept time. Hygiene became a chapter. History learned to speak in dates as well as dynasties. The schools were Jewish, yes, but the door they opened did not ask for papers. Muslims and Christians taught there. Sometimes they enrolled their own children. Modernity, like light, does not ask your creed before it enters a room. Outside the classroom, Iran wrestled with itself. The Qajar state negotiated concessions with Europeans, borrowed money, lost patience, lost face, and then found a new voice in the streets. The Constitutional Revolution, 1905 to 1911, wrote a charter that named Jews, Christians, Zoroastrians as recognized communities and handed each a seat in the modules, small in number, immense in symbolism. The old choreography of protection and humiliation did not vanish, but a new step was added: citizenship. You could be both a minority and a stakeholder in the law. The Alliance schools matured into a francophone corridor through which Iranians, Jewish and not, walked toward universities, clinics, engineering firms, and ministries. In Jewish quarters, the curriculum changed the smell of evenings. Homework under kerosene lamps, French readers beside psalms, mothers folding laundry while children practiced nasals, and R. The community's occupational palette widened. Merchants and dyers beside doctors, dentists, lawyers, teachers. Persian Jews who once measured dye in vats now measured dosages and contracts, without abandoning the old trades that had fed them for centuries. Then the crown changed. Reza Shah Pahlavi ruled from 1925 to 1941, pulled the country by the collar into secular modernity. Railways, a civil code, uniforms that made the state visible even in provinces that had seldom seen it. For Jews, this meant fewer intermediaries between their lives and the law. Certain humiliations fell away. Certain ambitions became thinkable. Synagogues multiplied in Tehran, whose gravity intensified with new factories, new boulevards, new chances. Under his son, Mohammad Reza Shah, ruled from 1941 to 1979, the momentum continued, uneven and real. The White Revolution, land reform, technocrats, a hunger for expertise that did not care what name you spoke when you prayed, as long as you could build the dam on time. A middle class emerged with Persian on the tongue and French in the margin. Jewish newspapers printed Persian in Hebrew letters and Hebrew in Persian cadence. Habib Levi wrote the first comprehensive modern history of Persian Jewry. Habib El-Ghanian rose as an industrialist whose factories glittered like a promise that the future could be made in Iran by Iranians of every faith. Weddings filled hotel ballrooms, charitable associations professionalized. Dozens of synagogues in Tehran alone kept the week's pulse, while in Shiraz, Isfahan, Hamadan, the quarters renewed themselves with plaster and paint instead of apology. Geopolitics, for once, seemed to align with community life. From the 1950s on, Iran and Israel cultivated quiet ties, technical exchanges, agricultural projects, a shared sense of being non-Arab states in a turbulent Arab neighborhood. Airplanes and know-how moved without megaphones. For Persian Jews, this did not feel like a divided loyalty. It felt like a widened horizon. You could visit relatives in Tel Aviv, a cousin in Paris, and return to Tehran, where your business license and your synagogue key sat in the same drawer. The Pahlavi decades were not a fable. There were still street-level prejudices, petty officials with old instincts, neighborhoods where rumor could bruise a day. But the center of gravity had shifted. Jewish life in Iran stood taller. Schools, clinics, trade associations, youth movements, a political voice in the miles that could be ignored but not erased. The Alliance had taught a generation how to handle exams, dental drills, contracts, and, perhaps most important, the posture of modern confidence. You could walk into a ministry with a file under your arm and expect to be heard. That expectation is a revolution, even when no banners fly. Underneath the progress, a subterranean tremor. Modernization without full participation breeds its own weather. Those left outside grow bitter. Those hurled forward grow brittle. Clerics watched the state's secular gate with a ledger in hand. Populists named corruption like a litany. The same highways that carried prosperity carried resentment. By the late 1970s, the barometer fell. What had felt like ascent began to feel like exposure. But before the storm, remember the light. A century after the first Alliance classroom opened its shutters, Jews in Iran could plausibly say, "We are citizens with rights, professions, property, institutions, and futures here."
Section 8. The mountain name, revolution, bees, chemistry. Revolutions rename everything. Streets, months, sins. They also rename people. In 1979, the city filled with paper and shouting. Sermons came on cassettes. Portraits appeared where clocks had been. Those who had walked through ministries with a file under their arm learned to walk with their heads lowered, as if the weather itself had turned accusatory. The old corridors, Alliance classrooms, French lycées, the polite offices of technocrats, lost their gravity. Doors that had opened to exams and salaries now opened to questions that did not have answers. The Jewish community felt the turn with an audible crack. Habib El-Ghanian, industrialist and philanthropist, was arrested and executed that spring, and a tremor ran through every quarter. The new state said it distinguished Zionism from Judaism. In practice, the distinction lived or died on a local official's mood. Synagogues kept their lamps. The constitutional seat in the Majlis remained. Travel and Hebrew studies narrowed to a sliver you could slip a prayer through. Families sold apartments quickly and quietly. Suitcases learned to sit packed by the door. Others stayed, tended their shops, lowered their voices, and rehearsed the sentence that would keep a neighborly peace. "We are Jews, not Israelis. We are Iranian." The storm touched everyone, Jew and non-Jew alike. Our own family was not Jewish, but the upheaval reached us all the same. From Paris, my father followed the fever of events, and for a brief season he threw himself into activism, believing the upheaval might bend towards something fair. Then he made the hard choice to return to Iran. Aging parents, papers, and property that needed a steady hand, and the stubborn hope that the storm would settle. For a while, he still believed. But as the clerics consolidated power and Iranians learned to set aside dreams of freedom, he understood that staying would require a smaller target and a steadier craft. He chose Beekeeper. At first it was an alibi. Then it became a vocation. He went to the mountains, where survival simplifies into work and weather. Hive boxes stacked like modest houses, veils and gloves, a smoker that smelled of thyme and ash. He learned the temper of honey, the timing of a split, the wrist sense for weather. Asked what he did, he answered plainly. Asked what he used to do, he bent toward the frames and said, "This." Years unfurled. The state's anti-Zionism remained loud. The community's Judaism remained disciplined and local. There were seasons of fear. The Shiraz 13 arrested in 1999 on charges that dissolved into releases. Emigration in waves, then pauses. There were seasons of ordinary life. Weddings with pomegranates and violins. accountants who balanced books, doctors who treated everyone who came through the door. Iran and Israel hardened into enemies. Iranian Jews learned to keep their identity separate from a geopolitics that wanted to weld everything into a single accusation. It is possible, if one is careful, to live a layered truth.
Section 9. Between Tehran and Jerusalem. History opens doors that do not agree with each other. One bears the name Persia, remembered in Jewish scripture as the empire that let exiles go home. Cyrus with his decree, Darius with his archive, letters from Susa that turned mourning into festival. Another bears the name Islamic Republic, chanting slogans against Israel until the older music is drowned. Between those doors stands a people required to pass through both at once, Iranian in tongue and soil, Jewish in covenant and calendar, carrying a quarrel they did not author. The state says, "We distinguish Judaism from Zionism." Some days that door swings like mercy. Some days it closes like iron. In Tehran, synagogues still open on Fridays. Esther and Mordecai still receive candles in Hamadan. Daniel still keeps watch in Shush. Hebrew is recited as prayer, not as passport. The rule is narrow but legible. Be a community, not a cause. Step carefully, and the door may hold open long enough for a wedding, a ledger, a child's lesson. Then the storm arrives from elsewhere. Gaza, Lebanon, the nightly news. The air thickens, and suddenly each word is a doorframe you must measure. Iranian Jews do what they have always done. Precision. They speak loyalty to their country, fidelity to their faith, and pray that both doors remain ajar. It is not strategy, but craft. The kind that keeps kitchens warm and schools open. Meanwhile, the diaspora learns to carry both doors at once. In Tel Aviv, Hebrew absorbs Persian vowels. In Los Angeles, sabzi simmers beside challah. In synagogues from Netanya to Encino, the blessing rises in the maqam of Shiraz. These families keep two keys, one for Israel, where the calendar is public, and one for Iran, where the memory tastes of saffron and limes. The temptation is to turn this into romance, exile as cuisine, survival as music. The truth is plainer. The Jewish presence in Iran endures because streets remember their names, because even the regime knows that persecuting an ancient minority advertises weakness, and because identity, practiced quietly, can survive where paper says it should not. Grandparents still light candles in Tehran. Grandchildren answer present in Hebrew class in Ramat Gan. Both speak truth, each through a different door. Empire could afford pluralism. It prized tribute more than uniformity. Nation-states crave cohesion. They test loyalty like exams. Persia once gave Judaism room. The modern quarrel narrows it to positions. Yet kinship outlives alliances. On the longest line, the one that runs from Cyrus to Sura to Shiraz, Iran and Judaism are not strangers, but neighbors whose doors once opened onto the same street. And so we return to the first door. Not the river gate of Babylon, but the alliance door. A courtyard in Iran dusted with chalk. Vowels crossing borders before people do. That door taught a boy to write a life across languages and taught neighbors to share a street without sharing a creed. No single door holds the house entire. But together, Babylon, Alliance, Tehran, they make a dwelling still recognizable, still inhabited. A school survives winter by two arts, discipline and light. Chalk dust gathers like snow on cuffs. A bell keeps time. A child learns a sentence that will outlast a season. When a society is afraid, ask what classrooms it keeps warm. In Iran, Light was a people praying softly, keeping a calendar not owned by the state. In Israel, light is a Shirazi melody after Lecha Dodi. In Paris and Los Angeles, light is a child, born of Alliance chalk and mountain smoke, carrying 3 languages without apology. Power is tested here. What rooms do you protect when you are strongest, and what lessons when you are afraid? Governments harden, seals change. The bells keep ringing, the doors keep swinging, and somewhere a board is wiped clean for the next line. Elias Winter, author of Language Matters, a space for reflection on language, power, and decline. Thanks for reading Language Matters. Subscribe for free to receive new posts and support my work.